Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website at weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for the state. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast, who that means as well. And you can email us at the address that is at the bottom of the screen. Starting off, we'll take a quick look at the watches, warnings, and advisories that we do have out for the state. In southeast Alaska, we have quite a few watches, and we do have one warning. That is a winter storm warning for heavy snow, and that is specifically for the Klondike Highway above 1,000 feet. And that is in effect from 3 a.m. on Wednesday until 9 a.m. on Thursday, again up by the Klondike Highway above 1,000 feet. We also have a winter storm watch in the area by Haines and another one for snow down by Hyder, and those are both for snow, and those are going to be in effect for earlier portions of Wednesday as we get further to the north in Wednesday afternoon, and then as we get further to the south more in Wednesday evening time frame. We also have several in the middle from Juneau through Sitka and down by Heidelberg. Those are all winter or high wind watches for high winds, and those are going to be in effect again in Wednesday afternoon to evening time frame for the more northerly locations, and down as we get by Heidelberg in Wednesday evening into Wednesday night time frame. Moving us to the northern part of this state, as we get into the Brooks Range, down into portions of the interior, those are all wind chill advisories, and these are going to be out throughout the southern portion of the Brooks Range, up by Wainwright, down through Seward Peninsula and the Norton Sound area again. All of these are wind chills throughout much of the interior Brooks Range and west coast, down to the Kuskokwim Delta as well. The more northern ones of the Brooks Range are going to start to expire later this evening. As we get further to the south, we're expecting those last till sometime around noon on Wednesday, and then ones along the west coast all the way down are going to last further into Wednesday night time frame and begin a little bit later, some of those beginning in Wednesday afternoon as well. As we drop down into the Aleutian Islands, we have blowing snow advisories for the central Aleutians, eastern Aleutians, and for the Alaska Peninsula, primarily around False Pass and Cold Bay for the peninsula areas. Further to the east should be a little bit safer from those low visibilities. Visibilities dropping down to around a half mile for all of these locations, and those will be in effect primarily through tonight and then into Wednesday morning. Taking a look back at the Kenai Peninsula area, we do have blowing snow advisories in this location as well, and those are going to be in effect Wednesday afternoon till around midnight. Visibility is dropping down to around a half mile, and those will be along many of the travel areas, especially along the highways, so be careful if you're driving through those locations. And then up in the Susitna Valley, we also have a flood advisory still out, and that's going to be out until Thursday, and that is for Willow Creek. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we have a decaying low pressure system bringing a lot of moisture to the North Gulf Coast, down in southeast Alaska as well, bringing some snow to many of those locations. So we get closer towards the North Gulf Coast, some of those areas getting a little bit closer to rain. Another low further to the south, bringing in some more precipitation to areas of the Gulf. Not too big of an impact until it starts to get a little bit closer to the very southern portions of southeast Alaska. As we look out a little bit further to the west, we have some lower cloud cover out through much of the northern and eastern part of the Bering Sea, bringing some lighter snow to these locations down into Nunavik Island as well. And then a bigger system that is moving to the south of the Aleutian Islands. That is one that's going to provide a lot of the conditions for the blowing snow advisories throughout the central eastern Aleutians and into the Alaska Peninsula as well. You can already see some of the precipitation out ahead of that moving into those locations. So look at the weather for the remainder of the day. We can see our warm front pushing into those locations. But as that system stays to the south of the islands, we are expecting the colder air to stay there for the Aleutians and Peninsula, keeping primarily snow for those locations with the stronger winds, providing those blowing snow conditions. We also have some snow moving up into the northern part of the Bering Sea around St. Lawrence Island. As we move to the northern part of the state, we do have high pressure over the area, bringing in some fog cover for the Arctic coastline. We have snow throughout the interior, stretching into the eastern parts of the interior and down into south central, where our weaker low out over the northern part of the Gulf is bringing in some precipitation along the North Gulf Coast, pushing in that rain line just to the coastline for many locations along the North Gulf Coast and down into southeast Alaska as well. More inland locations, especially as we get closer towards Haines and Skagway, are going to stay snow, but some of the locations near the water, especially as we get down by the Sitka area, are going to experience some rain with that. And as we move into tonight, kind of similar conditions. Southern locations not seeing as much precipitation at this time tonight, but then as we move up to the more northern locations, going to see some snow in those areas, starting to mix a little bit with rain as we get closer towards the water and closer towards the Gulf. As we move into south central part of the state, we are going to see some snow showers remaining through much of the night, and that's going to extend into the central and eastern portions of the interior. Some places out by Galena might see some lighter snow as well. Along the North Gulf Coast, going to see fog throughout the night, and then as we drop down into the Bering Sea, from the Bering Strait area through St. Lawrence Island down through the Bering, we are going to see some snow showers there, and continued snow for the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Islands, with the exception of the western Aleutians, as there is going to be some ridging building in that will prevent them from seeing some of the snow. As we move into Wednesday, a front way out west starting to push closer to the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some more precipitation to the area. And as we look out over the Bering Sea, snow showers for the most part, especially in the central and eastern portions of the Bering. That snow is going to linger into the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula as well. And then our main system is pushed now into the Gulf of Alaska, bringing even more precipitation to areas all along the North Gulf Coast. Primarily snow in most locations. However, as we get closer to the Gulf and for low-lying areas, starting to mix some of that over to rain. That's going to be true in southeast Alaska as well. We will still have some snow in the more interior locations, but as we get out by the Gulf, it is going to be starting to mix with rain. Interior portions of the state going to see some snow out in the eastern locations. Otherwise, not a lot of activity with some lingering fog up along the Arctic coastline. Then on Thursday, our low moving towards Prince William Sound area now, bringing more precipitation all along the North Gulf Coast. Similarly, we're going to see primarily snow with some areas by the water seeing some rain. Up into the interior, eastern portion is going to see some snow, and then up along the Arctic coastline, going to start to see some snow here on Thursday. Down in the Bering Sea, we are going to see snow showers throughout much of the Bering, and that does extend south all the way into the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutian Islands. And our system from the west is now skirting to the south of the islands, bringing a little bit warmer air and a mixed precipitation to the central Aleutian Islands. For our temperatures, we'll start out in the Aleutian Island area just below freezing for our lows tonight into Wednesday morning. Then in the Bristol Bay area, dropping down below zero, single digits below. In the negative 20s as we get into the YK Delta area. Negative teens as we get into the Seward Peninsula area, and back to the negative 20s along the Arctic coastline, with more eastern locations getting colder. We are dropping down to minus 44 for Arctic Village, and then increasing our temperatures as we get a little bit warmer as we move further to the south, getting to above zero as we get into south central Alaska, and just below freezing along the North Gulf Coast, and right around freezing for southeast Alaska. Wednesday afternoon, we'll be getting up into the upper 30s for many locations. Some places like Sitka getting up above 40 degrees for tomorrow afternoon. And as we look at south central Alaska, getting up into the 20s for some locations, a little bit warmer along the water, getting up to 38 for Cordova. In the interior, going to stay in the negative teens for the most part, and the negative 30s for much of the Brooks area. And then as we get into Arctic Village, not increasing at all tomorrow afternoon, staying at minus 44 for a high. Negative 20s along much of the Arctic coastline for high temperatures, and staying in the minus teens for much of Seward Peninsula, minus teens for much of the YK Delta area, and right around 0 degrees for the Bristol Bay area, just above freezing for the Aleutian Islands. So you look at our lows for Thursday morning, right around freezing for the Aleutian Islands, just below 0 for much of the Bristol Bay area, negative 20s for much of the west coast of the state and the Arctic coastline. Again, colder as we get further off to the east. And as we drop down into the interior, getting back into right around minus 20, above 0 for south central Alaska, and right around freezing for much of the southeast until we get by the water. As we move into our highs for Thursday afternoon, right around 40 degrees for much of southeast Alaska, up into the teens in some places along the coast, getting up to around freezing. In the interior, into the negative 20s for much of the area, colder as we get further to the north until we get along the Arctic coastline, where it's going to be warmer out to the west. Down the west coast, staying well below 0 throughout the afternoon highs on Thursday, and then we're going to stay into the mid-30s for the Aleutian Islands.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather. We have some MVFR conditions out over the northern part of the Bering Sea up by St. Lawrence Island as well, some IFR starting to mix in. IFR conditions over the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. Out over south central Alaska and into the interior, we do have some IFR conditions expected. That's going to extend into the eastern parts of the interior as well. Then along the North Gulf Coast, MVFR and IFR conditions expected, becoming more VFR as we get to southern areas of the Panhandle on Wednesday morning. Wednesday afternoon, MVFR conditions spreading throughout all of southeast Alaska, with IFR conditions further to the north, along the North Gulf Coast as well, and into south central Alaska, IFR conditions expected. A lot of the MVFR and IFR clearing up from the interior, with the exception of the upper Yukon Valley, where we are going to see some more IFR conditions Wednesday afternoon. Over the northern parts of the Bering Sea and around St. Lawrence Island, still some MVFR conditions expected, and MVFR conditions for the Alaska Peninsula. Then on Thursday morning, IFR conditions pushing in from the west towards the western Aleutian Islands, where we'll still have lingering MVFR and IFR conditions up in the northern part of the Bering Sea. MVFR conditions expected to move in Thursday morning up on the Arctic coastline, and then out over the interior part of the state, down into south central Alaska, IFR conditions expected, especially for the more eastern locations. All along the North Gulf Coast, we do expect some IFR conditions, much of the Gulf of Alaska as well, and then throughout the Panhandle, we are expecting IFR conditions on Thursday morning. Thursday afternoon, some of those IFR conditions are going to get pushed off more towards the north in the inside waters and up by the Haines and Skagway area. However, the rest of southeast is going to see some MVFR conditions that are going to spread out into the Gulf of Alaska as well. Eastern portions of mainland Alaska, we are expecting IFR conditions. And then up all the way on the Arctic coastline, especially for more western locations, we are going to have some IFR conditions up there. Then widespread MVFR conditions for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands Thursday afternoon. Moving down into the passes, Anaktuvuk Pass should be VFR throughout the day on Wednesday, as well as Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off VFR but drop down to MVFR as we move into the afternoon, whereas Rainy Pass will stay MVFR through the day. Windy Pass also expected to be MVFR, whereas Isabel Pass will be down to IFR for the day on Wednesday. Mentasta Pass a little bit better, MVFR conditions expected through the day, and Tanita Pass improving from IFR to MVFR as we move into the afternoon. Portage should be IFR throughout the day, as well as Chilkoot and White. So look at our freezing level, we do have the surface freezing line moving through southeast Alaska, then hugging the North Gulf coastline, extended out by Kodiak Island and out into the southern portions of the Bering Sea. Taking a look at our icing way out over the western Aleutian Islands, we are expecting some icing below 4,000 feet out there. Most locations from Alaska Peninsula up into southern portions of the interior down into southeast Alaska below 5,000 feet. The exception is going to be in south central Alaska. We are going to see a little bit higher for that icing, between 5,000 and 10,000 feet is expected there. For our jet stream, we do have a piece of the jet breaking off, moving over southeast Alaska around 95 knots. Much of mainland Alaska is going to be a little bit quieter in the way upper levels. However, out over the Aleutian Islands, 75 knots, becoming as high as 85 knots out of a northwesterly direction through the central and eastern part of the Aleutians. Strongest portion of the jet well to the south at 150 knots. At 9,000 feet way out west, we are expecting southerly flow, 40 to 50 knots expected there. However, as we move into the Bering Sea, we are expecting northerly winds for the most part, getting up to as high as 25 knots in the central part of the Bering, and then as we get by the eastern Aleutian Islands, up to as high as 35 to 40 knots expected there. Moving out to our main low pressure system that is south of the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, strongest winds are going to be on the southern side of this low, 45 to as high as 65 knots expected there out of the west. Western portions of mainland Alaska expecting to see northerly flow right around 20 to 25 knots. Eastern portions of the state a little bit stronger but out of a southerly direction, 35 to 40 knots there, with westerly winds up over the Arctic coastline. And then down over southeast Alaska, expecting to see winds in southeast around 35 knots, but increasing pretty quickly to 55 knots as we push off into northwest Canada. Dropping us down to 3,000 feet, still expecting to see the southerly winds over southeastern portions of the state around 35 knots there, diminishing pretty quickly once we get into the Yukon Territory area. And then as we move out over mainland Alaska, southerly flow over eastern portions, just off the coastline, 55 knots is expected. And as we move over to the west coast of the state, more northerly winds, 20 to as high as 40 knots down by southwest Alaska. And then most of the Bering Sea expecting to see northerly flow with the strongest winds by the Alaska Peninsula around 55 knots. Turbulence all along the North Gulf Coast and Aleutian Islands below 5,000 feet, for the most part a little bit higher there over southeast around 6,000 feet.
Hello again, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. And joining us again, talking about the augmented reality sandbox, is Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. And he's actually talking about a project from AKwx, which is the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. A lot of acronyms, but some really fun stuff today, right, Eric?
You bet. We've got a learning tool that is a tool that's fun to use, and it really has a relevance to actually daily lives of anyone who goes outside and sees lumpy topography in Alaska. We've got a lot of mountains and such. You know, when I was younger and go on your first hike in the hills, say, you're given, maybe you're in the Boy Scouts or you get at the kiosk at the trailhead, a topographic map, a flat piece of paper with all these lines on it, bullseyes, long lines that curve back on themselves, say, perhaps things that look like this. A quadrangle or a topographic map. We've got here just to illustrate a couple of examples near Denali. Alaska has so much topography, so many mountains. And what are all these lines that we see? It can be tough to know what this means the first time you look at it. What we've got, all these lines represent lines of where the elevation of the topography goes through a certain level above sea level, say that this line represents where the mountains have gone from below 1,000 feet, mean sea level, up through 1,000 feet and above. That's your 1,000-foot contour. And when the mountain keeps going up, you're up to 1,200 feet, 1,400 feet, and so on. And that's how you get this little bullseye around the peak of a mountain.
Kind of makes layered slices, right?
Kind of like layered slices. Nice way to look at that. And when you see the lines are closer together, you're going up more steeply. If the mountain rises more slowly, it takes you longer in horizontal space to go through those different vertical increments. So
that is really hard to visualize.
Right. Imagine you're looking at a 2D piece of paper, two-dimensional piece of paper, but you're trying to understand what the three-dimensional world looks like. Well, enter the augmented reality sandbox. Yes, what is that? It is right here. We have the sandbox with us today, Sandbox 2.0, portable version. Built up at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we've got a couple of folks helping out today.
Let's see, Alana Valaji, and she's a mechanical engineering student from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. If you want to give us a thumbs up there, Alana, thanks for helping us out today. And Courtney Breest, she's the outreach coordinator from AKwx, also helping us out today. Thanks, Courtney.
And this tool here has a Microsoft Kinect to sense the level of sand in this sandbox. And then the Kinect feeds its information into a computer that then sends a signal to a projector to draw the appropriate topographic lines on this topography. The fun thing about this, as we can see here, is that the sandbox and its Kinect and its projector, they all work as a team. So here we've got a mountain in the middle of the sandbox. What if we took down the mountain to some degree? Watch as the software responds and redraws the topography.
Kind of a caldera forming there.
There you go, And what's fun about the sandbox too is it knows that gravity flows downhill, and we've got some water that's actually down in the lowest elevations. And what's happening now is we're making it rain a little bit. We'll fill up rain into that elevated lake bed, that caldera, as you said. And so now water is pooled up there. And what if you gouged out an outlet channel?
Glacial dam release.
There you go. The water flows out. What we're seeing here is a tool that allows people to touch and connect, Microsoft Connect, RRR, to connect two-dimensional topographic maps like what we have here, these flat things on a piece of paper, to the real three-dimensional world. I think this sandbox's real particular application as a learning tool to young people is, what does a two-dimensional map mean when it's trying to represent the three-dimensional world? This sandbox is kind of both at once. It's actually three-dimensional, lumpy topography there, the sand, but it's got these lines drawn on the three-dimensional sand that would be on a two-dimensional piece of paper.
Wow, that is a huge leap from the learning that we experienced when we were younger to how children and even adults are visualizing in these new forms of technology. Allows that to kind of reshape their thinking and visualize this in a very useful and absolutely hands-on way. It's amazing.
It's a hands-on tool, and
it's hard for me to sit here and not go play with that.
Well, that's what happened at GINA, up at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, when the first model was being made, the prototype with plywood and such. We had professional adult professor types had heard about this, and they
Yeah.
came by because they wanted to see how it worked.
Okay.
And everyone becomes that idealistic, wonder-filled youngster.
Sure.
And you just can't help but play with that, and to see how it reacts in time, and
Right.
it's a dynamic learning tool, and it
Dynamic,
responds.
that's exactly the word.
And
Yeah.
you know, you wonder what applicabilities beyond a teaching
Right.
tool for
Where does it go?
topography can it have? You can see how in Alaska we have inundation mapping is an issue. If you had water slosh inland, say in a coastal flooding event
Right.
on the western coast of Alaska or the Arctic coast, you could see this. The concept is illustrated here as an introductory learning method. I think this is a potentially good outreach tool for all of us in Alaska.
Okay, so not only just a topographical sense, a mapping sense, maybe something that leads into understanding of how geographic information systems work with GIS, but also geology, if we wanted to get into kind of the formations and the bigger land masses and the representation of the 2D map. We could go into hydrology, which is very important in Alaska, of course. And even just understanding the weather sense. Mounding up a big pile of sand could be that Arctic high pressure system sitting on top of Fairbanks, and the voids would be low pressure systems. This can go a lot of different directions.
Yes, exactly. It's not just landforms, but pressure has contours of high pressure and low pressure. And I wish I had had this kind of a learning tool when I was taking
kidding.
Meteorology 101 back 25 years ago.
wow.
Would have been helpful, I think.
Probably would have gotten a better grade. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for coming by, Eric, and Alana and Courtney. Thank you so much for your help there in the sandbox. We are going to play in the sandbox a little bit more coming up tomorrow on our next edition of Alaska Weather Facts. We hope you join us for that. In the meantime, make sure you go to alaska.edu/EPSCOR. That's alaska.edu EPSCOR to learn more information about what we're doing with this augmented reality sandbox around Alaska. We'll see you next time on Alaska Weather Facts. And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For our marine forecast, we'll start off with a quick look at the ice edge. With northerly winds expected to continue, we are expecting more ice to get pushed further to the south and through the Bering Strait, covering the Diomedes and getting closer towards St. Lawrence Island. We also, over the night, had good ice coverage or good ice growth in Cook Inlet area. As we look out over the southeastern part of the state, we will have primarily southerly winds, with the strongest winds out over the Gulf, 35 to 45 knots, getting stronger as we move further to the north. However, in the inside waters, still going to see some stronger winds, primarily out of a south to southeast direction, 25 to 30 knots there, with gusts as high as 45 knots, especially in the more central locations. Then on Thursday, continuing to see a southerly direction, 30 to 35 knots in the inside waters. Then out over the Gulf, 30 to 35 knots, switching to become more southwesterly on Thursday. Seas as high as 26 feet in the Gulf, and that's going to be in locations a little bit further to the south. As you look over south central Alaska, out over the Gulf, primarily an easterly component to the winds, getting as high as 50 knots and a barrier jet as we get closer towards the North Gulf Coast, pushing into Prince William Sound. In Prince William Sound, however, we are going to have northeasterly winds around 40 knots there. Seas highest in the northern part of the Gulf around 17 feet. And then in Cook Inlet, we are going to see northerly winds 30 to 40 knots, stronger as we get further to the south. Then on Thursday, switching to become a little bit more westerly and getting high near the Barren Islands area up to as high as 55 knots. Storm force winds coming out of Kamishak Bay, seas as high as 24 feet there. And as we move out into the Gulf waters, we will see winds primarily out of a westerly direction, highest by the Barren Islands, 45 knots there, dropping down to around 30 and eventually becoming south as we get further off to the east. In Prince William Sound, we will have northwesterly winds around 40 knots. As we look out over the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, out over Kodiak, primarily southerly component to the winds as high as 45 knots through Shelikof Strait. Southwesterly winds on the eastern side of the island, around 30 knots there. As we move further out to the west, northerly winds around 40 knots, gusts on the Bering side, or on the Pacific side rather, around 55 knots there. Then on Thursday, dropping down to around 25 knots, staying out of that northerly direction, becoming more westerly as we get by Kodiak Island, around 40 knots there. So look at the Aleutian Islands starting on Wednesday, a north to northwest direction out over the eastern Aleutians, anywhere from 30 to 45 knots, strongest on the southern side of the eastern Aleutian Islands. Then as we look out further to the west, becoming more easterly, 25 to 40 knots, stronger as we get further out towards the western Aleutian Islands. Then on Thursday, winds staying out of that easterly direction, 35 to 45 knots. Stronger now as we get further towards the central Aleutian Islands with a low pressure system to the south. 50 knots south of the central Aleutian Islands out of an easterly direction, dropping down to around 30 knots as we get closer towards the eastern Aleutian Islands. Along the west coast of the state, primarily a northerly direction to the winds from 20 to around 35 knots, strongest south of Nunavik Island. And then on Thursday, staying out of that northerly direction, winds diminishing somewhat, 20 to 25 knots for the most part, weaker in Norton Sound, around 15 knots there. Along the Arctic coastline, weak northerly flow up along the coast. And as we get to the west coast of the state, northerly winds 20 to 25 knots, helping to drive that ice edge further to the south. Then on Thursday, we are going to see westerly winds 15 to 20 knots along the North Slope coast. And then as we get to the west coast of the state, northerly winds 20 to 25 knots there. Quick recap for the state. We do have some snow showers throughout the Bering Sea down into the Aleutian Islands, Alaska Peninsula area. Be mindful of potential for blowing snow advisories for the central and eastern Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Then as we move up along the west coast of the state, we will have some fog along the Arctic coastline. Not a lot in terms of precipitation, some lighter snow showers over the interior, central and eastern portions. However, we do have wind chill advisories out for much of the Brooks Range along much of the west coast and much of the interior. Check your local products for exact time frames and exact temperatures that those wind chills will get down to for your area. As we drop down into south central portion of the state, we will have snow for the Kenai Peninsula into other portions of south central along the North Gulf Coast into southeast part of the state as well. We do have some blowing snow advisories out for the Kenai Peninsula. Again, check your local times or your local areas for times and exact criteria for those blowing snow advisories. And then as we move into southeast Alaska, we do have some areas of heavy snow up by the Haines and Skagway area and down by Hyder as well. Then we do have some high winds expected with high wind watches out from Heidelberg through Sitka area up towards Juneau as well. Check your local forecast for those times and exact speeds and of snow amounts for those areas. And we will continue to see a push of that southeasterly wind, bringing in more snow and precipitation to southeast Alaska. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.